In the exclusive old money enclave of East Hampton, New York, there are houses and then there are legends. For a time, the mansion at 3 West End Road was just a house, a magnificent one to be sure, with 28 rooms, sprawling romantic gardens, and a view of the Atlantic Ocean. It was called Grey Gardens, and it was a symbol of a certain kind of American dream, the dream of the nation's unofficial aristocracy. But houses, like people, have their own destinies. And this house was destined to become something far more than a summer cottage for the wealthy. It was destined to become a crumbling palace, a private kingdom, and a monument to one of the most fascinating and heartbreaking mother-daughter stories in American history. Now fast forward 50 years from that perfect summer day. It's the autumn of 1971. A team from the Suffolk County Health Department, armed with a search warrant, forces its way onto the property. What they find inside would shock the nation and create a scandal that would reach all the way to the White House. The manicured lawns are gone, replaced by a tangled, waist-high jungle. The once elegant rooms are filled with mountains of garbage. The furniture is ruined, and there is no running water. The air is thick with the stench of decay and the overpowering presence of dozens of cats. And living amidst this squalor are 2 women, an elderly mother and her middle-aged daughter. The older woman is Edith Ewing Bouvier Beale. She is the aunt of the most famous and admired woman in the world, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. How did this happen? How did a woman born into the highest echelons of American society, a beautiful debutante with artistic ambitions of her own, end up living in a state of such profound decay, abandoned by her family and forgotten by the world? The story of Edith Beale and her house, Grey Gardens, is more than just a tale of lost fortune. It's a story about rebellion, about the suffocating weight of social expectation, and about the fierce, unbreakable, and sometimes destructive bond between a mother and a daughter who chose to create a world of their own amidst the ruins of their past. To understand Edith Beale, you must first understand the world she was born into. Edith Ewing Bouvier entered the world in 1895, a child of America's unofficial aristocracy. This was the world of the WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite, a rigid, insulated society governed by unspoken rules and ironclad expectations. It was a world of private schools, summers in the Hamptons, winters in the city, and a social calendar dictated by events like the debutante ball, a formal ceremony where the daughters of the elite were presented to society with the ultimate goal of securing a suitable marriage to a man of equal or greater standing. At the head of this particular clan was Edith's father, John Vernew Bouvier Jr., known as the Major for his service in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. He was a successful lawyer and a formidable patriarchal figure. He was handsome, proud, and deeply invested in the prestige and purity of his family's lineage. He had high expectations for all his children, but especially for his daughters. They were expected to be beautiful, accomplished, charming, and above all, to marry well, securing the family's position for another generation. His daughter Edith was certainly beautiful. She was a striking young woman with a sharp wit and a rebellious bohemian spirit that chafed against the strictures of her class. She was not content to be merely an ornament. She possessed a genuine artistic talent and a fine singing voice, and she harbored dreams of a life on the stage, a scandalous ambition for a woman of her social standing. Her father, the Major, strongly disapproved of these theatrical aspirations, viewing them as common and unbecoming. From a young age, the central conflict of Edith's life was established. The clash between her own artistic, free-spirited nature and the rigid, unforgiving expectations of her family and her social world. She made her society debut, as was expected, and for a time she played the part. In 1917, during the height of World War I, she met a man who seemed to be the perfect match. His name was Phelan Beale. He was a handsome, charming lawyer who worked in her father's law firm. He came from a good Southern family and possessed the ambition and social grace that the Bouvier prized. Their courtship was a whirlwind romance, and they were married in a lavish ceremony at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. The union was seen as a perfect dynastic match. Phelan Beale purchased the magnificent shingle-style mansion in the exclusive Georgica Pond neighborhood of East Hampton and presented it to his new wife. He named it Grey Gardens. For Edith, it must have seemed like the beginning of a fairy tale. For the first decade of their marriage, life at Grey Gardens was idyllic. The house was a hub of social activity, a testament to the Beales' status and good taste. The 28 rooms were beautifully appointed, the servants were plentiful, and the sprawling gardens, designed by a famed landscape architect, were a romantic paradise of climbing roses and wisteria, sloping down to the sea. Edith presided over this kingdom as its undisputed queen. She was a brilliant and captivating hostess, and the house was often filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and conversation. She gave birth to 3 children, a daughter, Edith, who would come to be known as Little Edie, and 2 sons, Phelan Jr. and Bouvier. She seemed to have everything a woman of her time and class was supposed to want: a wealthy, successful husband, beautiful children, and one of the most magnificent homes in the Hamptons. But beneath this perfect facade, the bohemian spirit that her father had tried to suppress still flickered. She continued to pursue her passion for singing, taking lessons and giving recitals for her friends, much to the growing disapproval of her husband. Phelan Beale was a more conventional man than his wife. He was focused on his career and his social standing, and he began to see his wife's artistic ambitions as an embarrassment. The first cracks in the fairy tale began to appear. The stock market crash of 1929 put a severe strain on Phelan's finances. The couple began to argue more frequently, their 2 fundamentally different natures, her artistic rebellion, his conventional ambition, coming into conflict. In 1931, the conflict reached its breaking point. Phelan Beale left his wife and family. The separation was a scandal in their small, insular world. For several years, they lived in a state of legal limbo. Then in 1946, Edith received a telegram from her husband sent from Mexico. It was a message of brutal, shocking finality. It read simply, "Have just secured divorce, Phelan." He had left her for a younger woman. The divorce was a devastating blow, not just emotionally, but financially. Edith was awarded the house, Grey Gardens, and a small alimony payment, but her primary source of income was gone. Her father, the major, who had never fully approved of her, was not inclined to be generous. He provided a small trust fund, but its income was barely enough to maintain the illusion of their former life, let alone the immense cost of running a 28-room mansion. This was the great turning point in Edith Beale's life. Faced with financial ruin and social humiliation, she was presented with a choice. She could sell Grey Gardens, downsize, and live a more modest, conventional life. But for Edith, Grey Gardens was more than just a house. It was the symbol of her identity, the last remnant of her lost kingdom. It was the one thing that was truly hers. In an act of profound and perhaps misguided defiance, she made a fateful decision. She would not leave. She would stay, no matter the cost. This decision would set the stage for the next and most famous chapter of her life, the slow, spectacular decay of both her home and her connection to the outside world. The great unraveling did not happen overnight. It was a slow, creeping process that took place over decades. As Edith's funds dwindled, the house began its slow descent into disrepair. First, the gardeners were let go. The once immaculate lawns and flower beds slowly surrendered to the wild, relentless growth of nature. The vines grew unchecked, crawling up the walls, covering the windows, as if the landscape itself were trying to reclaim the house. Then the servants were dismissed. The vast, empty rooms, once filled with life, grew silent and dusty. The paint began to peel, the roof began to leak, and the plumbing began to fail. Her sons, Phelan Jr. and Bouvier, grew up and moved away, building conventional lives for themselves, estranged from their mother's increasingly eccentric world. But her daughter, little Edie, was a different story. Little Edie had inherited her mother's beauty and her artistic, rebellious spirit. She had a brief, dazzling career as a model in New York and had dreams of becoming an actress. But she was also plagued by insecurities and a deep, complicated attachment to her mother. In 1952, at the age of 35, after a series of personal and professional disappointments, little Edie returned to Grey Gardens. It was meant to be a temporary visit. It would last for the next 20 years. The return of her daughter marked the beginning of the final phase of their retreat from the world. Together, mother and daughter created a closed, codependent universe within the crumbling walls of the mansion. Their bond was a complex tapestry of deep affection, shared memories, bitter resentments, and mutual dependency. They became each other's sole companion, audience, and antagonist. As the house physically decayed around them, they fortified themselves against the outside world, a world they felt had betrayed them both. Their social circle shrank, then disappeared entirely. Their only companions were the dozens of stray cats that they took in, cats that soon overran the property, and the raccoons that began to chew their way through the attic walls. Mother and daughter, the two Edies, were now completely and seemingly irrevocably alone together in their decaying palace. The world they created inside Grey Gardens was a universe unto itself, with its own logic, its own rituals, and its own language. It was a world of profound squalor, but it was also a world of incredible imagination and performance. For Big Edie, now confined mostly to her bed on the second floor, the house became her permanent stage. Propped up against her pillows, surrounded by cats and piles of dusty belongings, she held court. She would sing in her still beautiful, if slightly shaky, soprano voice, the songs of her youth echoing through the decaying rooms. She would dispense wisdom, tell stories of her glamorous past, and engage in constant circular arguments with her daughter. Their mother-daughter dynamic, captured with unflinching intimacy by the filmmakers Albert and David Maysles in their 1975 documentary, is one of the most complex and fascinating relationships ever put on film. They bicker relentlessly. Big Edie criticizes Little Edie's clothes, her cooking, her prospects. Little Edie bemoans her lost youth, blaming her mother for holding her captive at Grey Gardens. Yet, underneath the constant squabbling, there is a current of fierce, unbreakable love. They finish each other's sentences. They share private jokes. They are each other's fiercest defender against an outside world that has long since written them off. Their relationship was a kind of folie à deux, a shared madness, but it was also their primary source of strength and survival. Big Edie's philosophy, as revealed in the film, is one of stubborn, aristocratic defiance. She shows no shame about her poverty or the state of her home. In one famous scene, she declares, "It's very difficult to keep the line between the past and the present. Do you know what I mean? It's awfully difficult." For her, the glorious past of Grey Gardens and its squalid present were not separate. They existed simultaneously. She was still the lady of the manor, even if the manor was falling down around her. She possessed a sharp, biting wit and a profound, if eccentric, understanding of her own situation. She knew her family disapproved, but she refused to bend to their will. "I think this is a mean, nasty, rotten world," she says at one point, "and I'm glad I'm not in it." Grey Gardens was not just her home. It was her bunker, her fortress against a world she had rejected, long before it had rejected her. Their daily life was a routine of small, repeated rituals. They would cook meals on a small hot plate in the bedroom, since the main kitchen was unusable. They would listen to a radio talk show hosted by a woman named Pat Kennedy, a strange, disembodied voice from the outside world that punctuated their isolation. They would feed their ever-growing family of cats, and they would talk. They would talk about the past, about Phelan Beale's betrayal, about little Edie's lost suitors, about the glorious parties they once hosted. The house was a living museum of their own memories, and they were its sole curators and inhabitants. It was a life of profound deprivation, but it was also a life lived entirely on their own terms. For decades, the two Edies lived in this state of genteel, eccentric decay, largely ignored by their family and the outside world. But in the fall of 1971, their private world was violently breached. Following complaints from neighbors, the Suffolk County Health Department conducted a raid on the property. The official report reads like a Gothic horror story. Inspectors found that the house was unfit for human habitation. They documented a severe infestation of fleas, 52 cats living in unsanitary conditions, floors covered in filth and garbage, no running water, and gaping holes in the roof and walls. They found a raccoon living inside a wall in the pantry. The story was a local scandal, but it was about to become a national sensation because of one inescapable fact. The reclusive occupants were the aunt and first cousin of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, at that time the most famous and admired woman on the planet. The story was broken nationally by writer Gail Sheehy in New York Magazine, and quickly picked up by outlets like the National Enquirer. The headlines were brutal. The former First Lady's relatives were living in squalor. The Bouvier family, a clan that prized its image of aristocratic elegance above all else, was deeply, profoundly embarrassed. This led to one of the most contentious debates surrounding the Grey Gardens story: the role of the family. Had they been neglectful? Did they know the true extent of the decay? And was their eventual intervention an act of love or an act of public relations damage control? The truth is complex. The two Edies were fiercely independent and had for years resisted any attempts by the family to interfere. But the public scandal forced the family's hand. In the summer of 1972, Jackie Onassis and her sister Lee Radziwill stepped in. They arrived at Grey Gardens, and what they saw reportedly horrified them. They provided over $30,000, a very significant sum at the time, to have the house cleaned and repaired. A crew of workmen descended on the property, carting away tons of garbage, repairing the plumbing, and making the house habitable again. For a brief moment, it seemed that the family had rescued the two Edies from their own self-imposed exile. But this intervention led directly to the second great controversy of their lives. Lee Radziwill, who was exploring a career in filmmaking, initially planned to make a documentary about her own childhood in East Hampton, featuring her eccentric aunt and cousin. She hired the acclaimed verite filmmakers Albert and David Mayles to shoot it. But as the Mayles began filming, they realized that the most compelling story was not about Lee Radziwill's sanitized memories, but about the incredible raw and unfiltered world of the two Edies. They soon abandoned the original project and, with the Beales' enthusiastic consent, turned their cameras entirely on the mother and daughter inside Grey Gardens. This decision led to the 1975 documentary Grey Gardens, a film that is now considered a masterpiece of the genre, but one whose ethics are still fiercely debated. Were the Maysles brothers exploiting two vulnerable, eccentric, and possibly mentally unwell women for the sake of their art? Were they laughing at them, holding their poverty and their strange world up for public ridicule? Or were they doing something more profound? Were they empowering them, giving them the stage and the audience that Big Edie in particular had craved her entire life? The film does not offer easy answers. It presents its subjects with a direct, unblinking, and deeply empathetic gaze, allowing them to tell their own story in their own words, on their own terms. For better or for worse, the Maysles brothers had opened the doors of this private kingdom to the world, and in doing so, they turned the two Edies from local curiosities into international cultural icons. The release of Grey Gardens in 1975 was a polarizing event. Some critics were appalled, seeing it as an act of cruel voyeurism, but many others were captivated. They saw what the Maysles saw, two incredibly witty, intelligent, and defiant women who were living a life of extraordinary, if unconventional, freedom. The film slowly over years began to build a passionate following, eventually becoming one of the most beloved and influential cult classics of all time. Its cultural impact has been immense and varied. It has been cited as a major influence on generations of filmmakers, artists, and fashion designers. Little Edie's famously eccentric costumes, a sweater worn as a skirt, a towel wrapped into a turban, a fur coat worn over a swimsuit, have been endlessly referenced on runways and in fashion shoots. The film's dialogue, a treasure trove of witty, philosophical, and heartbreakingly poignant one-liners, has been quoted and memorized by its legions of fans. The story was so compelling that it was later adapted into a Tony Award-winning Broadway musical and an Emmy-winning HBO film starring Drew Barrymore and Jessica Lange. But the most significant legacy of Grey Gardens is the way it transformed the two Edies themselves. They became unlikely celebrities, celebrated not for their wealth or their beauty, but for their fierce, uncompromising individuality. They were icons of nonconformity. In a world that demands we all play by the same rules, the Beales created their own. They showed that there was a kind of nobility, a kind of freedom in rejecting the world's expectations and living entirely according to one's own truth, even if that truth existed amidst filth and decay. For Big Edie, the film was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. After decades of being told her artistic ambitions were improper, she had finally found her audience. The whole world was now her stage. In 1977, just 2 years after the film's release, Edith Big Edie Beale passed away in her sleep at Grey Gardens. She was 81 years old. She had lived to see her home restored and to see herself become a star. After her mother's death, little Edie finally left the house, attempting to build a new life for herself, first with a brief and notoriously chaotic cabaret career. Grey Gardens itself was eventually sold to the journalist Sally Quinn and her husband, the longtime editor of the Washington Post, Ben Bradley. They painstakingly restored the house to its former glory, preserving the spirit of the place while making it a beautiful home once again. In the end, what is the story of Edith Beale and Grey Gardens truly about? It is not at its heart a story about squalor or mental illness or the decline of the American aristocracy. It is a story about defiance. It is a story about the fierce, complex, and deeply human bond between a mother and a daughter who, when faced with a world that no longer had a place for them, decided to build a world of their own, The crumbling mansion was more than just a home. It was a physical manifestation of their psychological state. It was a crumbling monument to a lost and glamorous past, but it was also a fortress of their own making, a bunker that protected them from the judgment and the demands of the outside world. Edith Beale could have chosen a different path. She could have sold the house, accepted her reduced circumstances, and faded into quiet obscurity. But she chose to stay. She chose her kingdom, even a kingdom of ruins. And in that choice, she found a strange and profound kind of freedom. Her story teaches us that there is beauty to be found in imperfection, that there is dignity in defiance, and that the most compelling lives are often the ones lived furthest from the beaten path.